Good morning, everybody. I'm so delighted that you are here today. My name is Peter Walsh. This is Tom Jones. Tom, welcome. I'd like us to begin with prayer. So let us pray. O God, you made us in your image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love. And work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So welcome everybody to Sunday Mornings with Tom. We're going to have, over the next few weeks, a conversation about race in America today. But before we get started, I just want to take a pause here, and I want to recognize what was for 12 weeks Sunday Mornings with Mike Handler, the Emergency Management Director for the town of New Canaan. As many of you who are listeners and watchers here know that Mike is no longer the Emergency Management Director for the town of New Canaan. I just want to pause and take a moment to thank Mike for the community, for his 20 years of service to the community, for his 9 years as the Emergency Management Director, and for his stewardship of all of us, the people of New Canaan and beyond, during the coming of the pandemic. And I want to thank Mike personally and from the parish for all that he did for all of us through this stream. As you know, Mike was a volunteer. He came on Sunday mornings as a volunteer, and he served us mightily. So peace be with you, Mike, and God bless you. And welcome to you, Tom, as we pivot in the conversation. As you know, I said to you on the phone the other day, you're a friend of mine. You've been a member here for 30 years. And I find it really hard to introduce you because there is so much to say about you. For those of you who do not know of this is a memoir that Tom wrote, produced, and published by Cornell Press. A fantastic read, Tom, just a fantastic read. So what are you doing here? So 55 years ago, you had a gun in your arm, in your hand. You had a machete on your belt. The issue was race. Out of that came incredible things. Eventually, the Afro Studies Department at Cornell, I'm not sure I've got the name exactly right. You graduated from Cornell with 2 degrees. You were on the board, an emeritus member of the board of the medical school. You've received the highest award for service to Cornell. You've got honorary degrees. You have had an amazing career in corporate life, just shocking, really. And not to say there weren't some intense setbacks that you handled with humility and were set free from burdens that were unfairly set before you. You also serve on boards of companies that all the rest of us know about and have heard of. Just amazing. The list goes on. It's way too long. Freddie Mac and Travelers and Pepsi. Also the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And Mass General and the Brookings Institute. So I'm going to pull the plug on that. That introduction could have gone for hours, folks. But just to say, the reason we love you, not the reason we love you for who you are, but we, as a community, greatly, greatly honor your voice on the issue of race in America. And we're grateful to you for agreeing to speak with us over these next few Sundays, so that we can get your insights. And I say to everybody out there, if you have questions or comments for Tom, just do this with your fingers. It arrives, as you know, in Jill's inbox, and then she gives voice to it. So Tom, welcome. God bless you. So what do you make of where we are today?
Thank you, Peter. Let me preface I want to make 3 points about this kind of juxtaposition, this perfect storm of the outrage over police brutality against the black community, along with this storm of the impacts, the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the black community. I want to make 3 points about that, but let me preface my remarks by saying that I understand the anger that's being expressed in the streets. I understand that outrage. And I understand it because I was once an angry young man. So I know those feelings. I know why they feel that way. and I sympathize with it. So that's just a preface. With regards to this perfect storm of police brutality against the black community and the COVID-19 impact on the black community, I want to cast my remarks in the context of what I see as what I would call, in this perfect storm, I see some rays of sunshine. I see some rays of hope. And the first point I would make is I put the murder of George Floyd in historical context. In 2018, I visited the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. It's a powerful exhibit. There are stone coffin-shaped objects suspended from steel pipes down from an arching ceiling. And each of those stone coffins, so to speak, is inscribed with the name and dates of the lynching of a black person in America between the years 1870, just early years of Reconstruction after the Civil War, through 1950, an 80-year period. There are 4,000 of these stone coffins with names, and the builders of the monument think that there are actually thousands more black Americans who were lynched, but they couldn't get complete documentation with regards to the names and dates. But my point is, you think about that, 4,000 people lynched in an 80-year period. That is the equivalent of one black person lynched every single week in this country, week after week, for 80 consecutive years. Think about what that says as a statement of how this country felt about its black population and the message of, you stay in your place or you will die. So that's the historical context in which I put the George Floyd murder. Because the truth is, as awful and unacceptable as the George Floyd murder is, the truth is that that kind of savage brutality against black Americans, that happened 50 times more frequently 50 years ago, and 100 times more frequently 100 years ago. And so even though any incident is one too many, I actually see, a measure of progress that the frequency has diminished so greatly that they are now much more isolated in the rate of occurrence. So I take a measure of hope and positive progress from that. Second point I would make, second ray of hope, second ray of sunshine in this storm, is that as I watch the thousands of protesters on the streets, I'm in city after city, actually all around the world, I'm struck by the size of the crowds and the diversity of the crowds. I mean, sometimes in some of the cities, there are more whites or Asians than there are black marchers. Sometimes even in the crowds in New York City, depending upon the location, there are more white marchers than there are black marchers. And I'm really encouraged by that. I'm encouraged also, that diversity of protest encourages me. The fact that police chiefs all around the country have spoken out condemning the tactics that were used in Minneapolis by the policemen in Minneapolis. The fact that policemen on the beat in front of the marchers in many cities, you can see policemen taking a knee to express sympathy with the point that the marchers are making. There are governors of many states and senators and other senior political figures who are speaking out, expressing remorse, and committing to leading legislative action to address these police practices. So I take encouragement from that. I take hope and encouragement from that, that there's such a broad, diverse community upswelling of expression of humanity and solidarity and unity with the Black community. And so to me, that's a real positive. The third ray of hope that I see, the ray of sunshine that I see, is with regards to this COVID-19 impact, disproportionate impact on the Black community. The entire country is seeing that and noticing and talking about how the infection rate and death toll is disproportionately high in the Black community. And the entire country is seeing that what we have called essential workers are disproportionately people of color. These essential workers have occupations such as hospital orderlies and nursing home attendants and emergency medical technicians and public transit workers. And the entire country is seeing that these people in these modestly paying occupations have no choice about working remotely. They have to go to work. And the entire country is seeing that often they're not provided adequate personal protection equipment. And the entire country is seeing that, the lack of adequate access to primary care has created underlying conditions of various forms of morbidity, underlying sickness in the Black community, which has made it vulnerable to now this killer virus that comes along and is especially effective attacking you if you're slightly ill to begin with. The entire country is seeing that as we have shut down businesses, shut down the economy, that the service occupations, the people that work in the restaurants and the people that work in the personal service salons and beauty shops and nail parlors and so on, all those personal services businesses, there are disproportionate numbers of people of color. And so this wave of unemployment that's come out of this pandemic has created disproportionate economic hardship in Black and brown communities. And now in the last couple of weeks, you've seen corporate CEO after corporate CEO speaking out saying, I recognize my obligation to have my company provide leadership in giving greater equality of economic justice to the Black and brown community. So again, I see a ray of sunshine, a ray of hope that comes out of this perfect storm.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. So interesting. The perfect storm, the coming together of all these elements. I wonder if you might just say a little bit about all these elements come together. They've created a tsunami that has really raised up different races and colors and creeds. Everybody saying, no, we can see this. We're done. We need some change. I wonder if you could just list some of those areas of change that you see that, because it's not just changing one thing. It would have to be changing many things to bring a more equitable playing surface for Black and brown people.
Well, I think that there are 6 specific areas where we need legislative action at the federal level. The first would be with regards to national standards for police training, police certification, and independent oversight boards to ensure accountability for police conduct. That's step one. That's how we get rid of abusive police practices, and we get rid of the things that protect the bad apples, such as this law in New York City, in New York State called 50A, which shields police disciplinary records from being able to be seen by the public in the context of subsequent events, or in the case of this Minneapolis officer, Chauvin, who is responsible for the George Floyd murder. That officer had, I think it was 17 or 18 disciplinary violations, some of which were for unnecessary violence. So, police conduct reform is the first area in which we need to take action. Second area, everybody knows that the prerequisite for success in the modern American economy is quality of education. But we don't want to face up to the fact, Peter, that in communities like this, like New Canaan, the well-to-do, successful people cluster together, and we use our wealth expressed through property taxes to create educational systems which prep our children. They gear and prep our children to succeed in the meritocracy, what we call a meritocracy. But, it's areas in which our kids are trained to excel. And the kids in New Canaan get disproportionate resources to excel. I'm not implying that this is immoral. In my own case, this was so important that we sent our children to private school because we didn't think even the New Canaan school system invested enough in the kids. And my wife, Addie, was the president of the Board of Trustees at King Low Haywood. So that's how we feel about the importance of education. But the point is that these resources that we put into the education of our kids in towns like Gold Coast, Fairfield County, it can't be matched in the inner city. I mean, we know that just 20 miles from here, kids in Bridgeport don't have the same resources supporting their education. So the point is that there should be federal funding of educational resources which ensure that the quality and scope of resources available to inner city children, in fact, children all over the country, their opportunity should not be limited by the wealth of their parents. Okay, so that's point 2, federal educational support for K-12. Point 3 would be vocational education. Mm-hmm. When you and I were growing up, many kids in high school geared themselves to occupations such as auto mechanic and plumbing and electrician and well-paying, honorable ways to earn a living. A lot of that has kind of disappeared from many school systems, and we don't do nearly enough of what you see in countries like Germany, where people trying to enter those occupations not only receive the vocational training in high school, but they're immediately linked into apprenticeships, at companies, which actually shape their skill, and it ensures that the vocational training they're receiving is actually of value to employers in that field, and puts them in apprenticeship positions, which then puts them on the ladder to full employment and economic success. So we need to have, again, federal support for vocational training which gives those who are not desirous of doing college. You know, some people just like to work with their hands or do a different kind of work. People have different skills, different capacities that need to be honored. And so we need to put resources into that kind of vocational training to create ladders of success for people who would prefer that set of opportunities. Fourth thing I would do is have, there's something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's in the federal tax code, which kind of gives a reverse income tax. It's a reverse top-up to low-income people who file federal taxes, and depending upon the level of income, the number of dependents, they actually get a credit, i.e. instead of writing a check, they receive a check. That kind of program should be expanded because it says, the message of that is, we reward you for working. And, if we expand that kind of program, the goal should be that everybody who works should be able to afford to live at a dignified standard of living. That's a statement of moral solidarity with anybody who works. No matter how modest the occupation or how modest your income, we can have solidarity with you to be sure that because you work, you will have a dignified standard of living. Fifth thing I would do is this point of access to adequate medical care. One of the reasons for the pandemic disproportionate impact in communities of color. We need to expand Obamacare or whatever version, whatever, successor federal health insurance program would be designed, but universal access to primary care, adequate quality care is an absolute moral imperative. And the last point would be retirement income adequacy. One of the most successful anti-poverty programs in the history of this country is the New Deal legislation creating Social Security. You may not know this, but actually back in the 1930s when Social Security was created, it was designed in such a way that it intentionally excluded many black workers. The Southern legislators in Congress intentionally designed Social Security. They insisted that the occupations of agricultural worker and domestic worker, meaning household domestic worker, were excluded from Social Security coverage. Of course, those two occupations were predominant occupations in the black community at that time. So the program was designed to keep black people at a lower level. It's one of the most successful anti-poverty programs in the history of this country, lifting the elderly out of poverty. It needs to be expanded and strengthened so that, again, this moral commitment. We know that many people of modest incomes are not going to be able to save enough money to support a dignified retirement. Sure. So let's expand Social Security in a way that, again, repeats that moral commitment. You have done your labor, you've earned your rest and your retirement, and we have a moral obligation to see that it's a retirement in dignity.
Yeah, wow, thank you for that really thoughtful response to a simple question. So when a tsunami and a wave comes, there's a portion of it that seems that it's the most energized portion of it. I don't know if you've ever been in a hurricane. You see the top of that wave, and it's utterly petrifying as it's coming at you. But the real movement is all the gallons of water underneath that are coming. That's actually what does the damage. It's not the thing that falls on you. It's the surge below. And you've talked a little bit about the surge of people in the streets that transcends race, color, and creed. popular rising upness, a movement forward, and yet it's moving forward into certainly the worst partisanship that I know of in the United States, certainly in memory of our lives' memory. This surge comes into a kind of World War I battle lines where we have one side here dug in, one side here dug in, and periodically some people get into no man's land in the middle. This is a no man's land movement. It's going to take both sides to work together. What do you make of that as political process would have to bring about many of the results that you're talking about?
Well, again, I'm encouraged because a very interesting report I heard on National Public Radio a few days ago. They were saying that public opinion polling back in the 1960s, at the time of the Democratic National Convention police action against the protesters, public opinion polls were showing 75% support for the police action against the protesters. And of course, that was one of the reasons why Richard Nixon was elected in 1968.
I remember that.
Public opinion polling now is showing 65% support for the protesters. You know, and this is why I was making that point earlier, the entire country is seeing what's actually happening. So, you know, that camera video of the officer in Minneapolis, clearly depraved indifference to the life of this human being, 8 minutes and 46 seconds with this human being pleading, "I can't breathe," and the officer with his knee on the neck and his hands in his pocket. Very casual position. Not a position of I'm defending myself or I'm taking on a violence. Very casual. He's got his hands in his pocket like he's walking to the candy store or something. With his knee in the neck, 8 minutes and 46. So the entire country is seeing that. The entire country is seeing the victims, the people of color who are the victims of the pandemic. And so that's one of the reasons why the polling is now, if NPR is right, significant majorities of the country are saying this is not right. And I personally think it's going to be reflected in the election this fall.
Yeah, really interesting. Just that whole scene, which is, there's no word for it. Following the Holocaust and World War II, a lot of theology was written about evil and what was the face of evil, and much of it was written. It was like that. It wasn't a violent act that was rageful. It was a violent act that seemed to be deadened of humanity, just without humanity. What human being could do such a thing?
It was the indifference. Another example of that. I mean, I don't know if you saw the video in Buffalo, where that elderly man, the 75-year-old man, stepped out in front of the police, and one of them pushed him to the ground, and he started bleeding. One of the police officers reached down to try to help the man, as though, oh my goodness, what's happened? And the other officer pushed him forward. No, don't help out. So, that kind of portrayal of indifference. Here's a man lying on the ground, bleeding, but let's just push on. So the entire country is seeing that kind of indifference, that indifference to humanity. And that's why I think the polls are now strongly in support of the demonstrations. And I frankly, that's why I'm an optimist about this, and that's why I've made my remarks in the context of I see rays of sunshine. I think that positive developments are going to come out of what's happened.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Joe, some thoughts from folks?
So this writer references an article in the New York Times this morning, which identifies the police unions as being one of the big problems that are impeding police reform. And he suggests also that perhaps in New York, the American Federation of Teachers is also can be an obstacle in achieving education reform. And how do you confront the problems of unions as obstacles to reform and progress?
Excellent question.
What a great question.
And it is true that the police unions in New York are the reason why this law 50A keeps police disciplinary records private. Politicians such as Mario Cuomo have just announced that if legislation comes to him repealing 50A or reforming 50A, it will be signed. Politicians such as Mayor de Blasio, who was one of the reasons 50A was tightened up 4 years ago to give even more protection to the police, de Blasio has said, I made a mistake. This has to change. So I believe that the push that's going to happen in the New York legislature to repeal or substantially change 50A is going to succeed. So again, I see a ray of sunshine. I don't think the police union is going to be able to block that. With regards to the teachers' unions, I'm not going to criticize them. I will say that the way I would approach federal educational reform and that funding for school children all around the country is that I would empower the families. I would give those dollars, federal dollars on a per capita basis, to the families and let those families choose, let those families be empowered. I can send my child to this local public school system if I think it's going to do a good job for my child, or I can use my voucher to send my child to a private school, or I can use my voucher to send my child to a charter school, i.e., I would empower the parents to feel like they have the same dignity and the same spending power as parents in New Canaan feel. That I have the power through my tax dollars or my checkbook to decide where I want my child to be educated, and the educators are accountable to me in terms of the quality of the job they do. So I would not give the federal money to the big bureaucracies. I'm not criticizing the teachers union, but there are questions about how effective big bureaucracies are. I would empower the lower income citizens to have the same caliber and scope of resources and choices as upper income Americans have.
So as you know, the New York City school system has 1 million students in it, which is shocking. And our own Syra Borsi, her father was the first person of color, was the chancellor of that system. Incredibly complex system. And as you've pointed out, the need for education, for our kids to grow up empowered to be full functioning human beings in our world, and the role of unions, again, interesting, complex. Jill?
So the next question is just if you would offer your thoughts about the riots and looting versus demonstrations and in the context of demonstrations.
I think it's necessary and appropriate to protest against the police brutality and the impacts of the COVID-19 on communities of color. I don't think that riots and looting are either appropriate or necessary. I think they send the wrong message, and those tactics will not be what moves this country forward. They will not be what unites this country. To me, one of the saddest things as I watched some of the pictures of riots, some of the looting that had occurred in both Minneapolis and New York, were entrepreneurs of color
Yeah.
who had put everything they had into creating these small businesses. And they even tried to paint signs like black-owned business. And the looters didn't care. They didn't care. These are not people that are sending a social message. It's not them. They can try to dress it up and hang on the fringes of protesters, but no. I mean, these business people of color, my heart went out to them. Some of them were saying, I have no insurance. How am I going to replace the things that have been looted from my store? Why would they do this to me? So there is no moral justification for the looting and the rioting. I just reject it unequivocally.
And what would you say to organizations that are organizing and sponsoring protests and marches, organizations like Black Lives Matter and others, to, as far as their responsibility to try to mitigate or reduce these kind of fringe activities?
I understand Black Lives Matters, and I sympathize with Black Lives Matters, and as I said in my preface, I understand their anger, and I was once an angry young person, and so I understand where they're coming from. I'm not sure it's fair to say that they can be held responsible for the irresponsible actions of people that kind of hang on the fringe of their movement. In most of the protests I have seen, the protest leadership has been clearly saying, this is a peaceful demonstration. We are not here to break windows or throw stones or throw objects at the police. This is a peaceful demonstration. So I'm not sure that it's fair to hold Black Lives Matter responsible for the irresponsible people on the fringes.
Should I keep going? I've got more.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So these questions are kind of linked. After the protests are over, what can we do to continue to support the systemic change? And related, what can those of us who are not people of color do to be caring and effective allies?
Good questions. I think the way that you demonstrate and become effective allies is, there was a march in New Canaan the other day. Father Peter read a prayer at the demonstration in New Canaan with regards to showing solidarity to communities of color. There were marches, there were demonstrations in Darien, and I heard that there was 600 people turned out in Greenwich last night. I think that's important to tell the country that even in these Gold Coast, the one in Westport, that's important to tell the country that even in these Gold Coast, Connecticut towns, people are saying what's happening to the black community is not right and it needs to change. That's a powerful message. One of the ways you make sure that the improvements actually occur is expressing your political voice. This fall's elections are going to be very important, and you need to articulate to our legislators that you care about these issues and want candidates to be putting forth constructive, positive proposals with regards to addressing the problems that are now evident.
So Tom, thank you for that. And yes, I must say I was most moved by the movement in New Canaan, and were it not for our masked days here, I'm sure it would have been twice. I'm very clear about that, because for all the weeks we spent with Mike Handler, there was not appropriate social distancing. But people chose in the community to say, I believe in social distancing, but this pandemic of racism in America is greater than that one, and I'm going to go for it. I'm going to risk it. Mike always used to talk about the risk-reward ratio that one had to choose in their own life, and I felt that the people in our community who moved decided it was worth the risk because there's a greater reward out there, which is a greater equitable life for people of color. So in the coming times, just to help people out there, I want to continue the conversation with you. And next week, let's pick up on the economy. You have spent your life immersed in the economy as a businessman, being on the board of the Fed, and as a black man. You and Addie, the story of you and Addie is an American story at its best. Albeit marred by some very difficult circumstances, but the way that you guys moved to Boston and started to renovate those homes in the South End. And I want you to come back and talk to us. You shared some of this with me on the phone in the past few days. Your insights are just so powerful, and particularly to people, at least my age, who lived through this. You're naming times, places, movements, and talking about the baby boomer generation, the largest generation alive in our country right now, and how you all went from this on the cover here, Tom, representing the baby boomers, to in some sense a different perspective. And so I'm most anxious that all of you come back next Sunday to listen to Tom. Further, I hope that everybody might do this with Jill, and so that we might talk more about practical steps. One of the great questions for us is a huge amount of energy has been raised, and how are we to use that energy for good? As you and I have spoken on the phone about the need to make structural changes in legal systems and reforms, and then to have character to lead us forward in this movement that the fullness that we say around here, the glory of God as a human being fully alive, that is actually for everybody. That's not just for some people. So God bless you, Tom. Do you have a last word here for us before we sign off and go to church? Anything?
Well, I've enjoyed this conversation very much, and I hope that it gives the St. Mark's community and the people of New Canaan a lift, a spiritual lift, and a sense that in this storm that's enveloping our country, there are indeed some rays of sunshine. History always shows that out of the most negative events, there are always positive possibilities if we can see them and if we can seize them.
Yeah, some of you know who follow my video logs. My last video log was an interview with Lise Least, longtime friend of yours and Addie's. And Lise is talking about the work she's done throughout her life and reflecting on what it was like to be a little black girl, to be a black woman in America now today, and leading in her way, a way forward to make positive change on the ground. She's talking about her work with Future 5. But one of the things she says is, what do we need to do? We need to listen. Instead of coming with our prepackaged answers, we need to listen. And so we are all delighted to listen to you. You have a very important voice for us to listen to. And so God bless you and thank you. And I can't wait to see you next week. Thanks everybody out there, and peace be with you, and peace be with Addie and your household and your tennis game later today. Okay, take care. Thanks everybody.